The autumn of 1847 enveloped the fields of Vermont in a mist that seemed to carry whispers of forgotten ages and unfulfilled promises. Samuel Whitmore, a farmer of pure blood and unwavering faith, watched his children run among the golden corn rows without knowing that ancestral forces had already marked his lineage for harvest. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Whitmores in Christian peace was about to witness the corruption of everything it meant to be human. But normalcy was about to be shattered by claws extending from abysses where God's light had never penetrated. Rebecca Whitmore adjusted the kitchen curtains for the 10th time that morning, an inexplicable uneasiness making her hands tremble as she watched Thomas, Mary, Benjamin, and little Sarah play in the yard. At 29, she had learned to trust the instincts that motherhood had sharpened, and something in the quality of the air, in the way shadows seemed to move on their own, whispered warnings that her rational mind refused to process. The farm dogs had begun howling during the early morning hours, a chorus of lament that echoed through the valleys as if the earth itself wept for something yet to come. It wasn't the sounds that began to disturb them, but the absence of them, a silence that settled over the property like a shroud, suffocating even the whisper of wind through dry leaves. The horses, which had always been docile and predictable, refused to leave the stable after sunset, their wide eyes fixed on something humans couldn't see. The dairy cows clustered in the farthest corner of the pasture, all facing the same direction, watching the tree line with attention that chilled the blood of any observant watcher. Samuel walked every inch of the property searching for rational explanations for the animals' behavior, but found only evidence of a presence that defied comprehension. Footprints that appeared during the night, not from known predators but circular marks that seemed to burn the grass where they touched. The chickens stopped laying, remaining agitated even during the day, as if they felt hungry eyes watching every movement. The air itself seemed denser, charged with electricity that made hair stand on end and children wake with nightmares they couldn't explain. It was Rebecca who first noticed the changes in the children. Thomas, always responsible and obedient, began drawing strange figures in the yard's sand circles within circles that hurt the eyes when observed too long. Mary stopped singing church songs, whispering melodies in a language no family member recognized. Benjamin spoke less and less, but when he did, his words carried knowledge that a 5-year-old child shouldn't possess. And Sarah, the youngest, had begun talking to someone no one could see, her crystalline laughter echoing in response to voices only she heard. The letter from Burlington arrived like a disguised blessing, offering Samuel the opportunity to sell part of the cattle for a price that would guarantee the family's prosperity during the harsh winter approaching. He couldn't know that his departure was part of a much larger plan, that ancient forces awaited exactly that moment of vulnerability. Rebecca watched her husband prepare his bags with a heavy heart, an irrational certainty that she was being abandoned at the hour when she most needed protection. The children said goodbye to their father with an unnatural calm, as if they knew his absence was necessary for something important to happen. The first night alone brought with it a subtle but unmistakable transformation in the nature of reality around the farm. Rebecca put the children to bed with longer prayers than usual, but her words seemed to echo strangely in the rooms, as if something was absorbing the sacred power of her pleas. The silence that settled over the house wasn't the comforting peace of rural life, but something deeper and hungrier. A void that seemed to pulse with its own life, feeding on the domestic tranquility that had always protected the family. Every creak of old wood sounded like a conspiratorial whisper. Every shadow seemed to move with malicious purpose. The lights appeared shortly after midnight, not as familiar stars, or the crescent moon that should bathe the fields in benign silver, but as open wounds in the fabric of night, points of luminosity that pulsed with colors that had no names in human language. Rebecca felt drawn to the kitchen window by a compulsion she didn't recognize as her own, her bare feet finding the cold floor as she watched the lights dance in patterns that made her vision blur and her mind tingle. They weren't earthly lights, they were lures for incautious souls, luminous bait to fish human consciousness from the dark waters of the cosmos. The compulsion grew until it became irresistible, every fiber of Rebecca's being vibrating in resonance with the frequency of those alien lights. Without realizing how she had made the decision, she found herself walking through the front door, her shawl thrown over her shoulders, offering illusory protection against cold that didn't come from temperature but from something much more fundamental. Her feet found the path through wet grass as if they had practiced that journey for years, each step taking her farther from the safety of home and closer to a destiny her conscious mind refused to contemplate. The figures emerged from the lights, like nightmares, gaining solid form, not as tall, slender, with limbs extending in proportions that violated the laws of human anatomy. Their faces were familiar and alien simultaneously, like distorted reflections of humanity seen through corrupted water. The eyes were most disturbing, large, luminous, containing intelligence so vast and indifferent that Rebecca felt her sanity begin to unravel at the edges just by sustaining that gaze. When the nearest being extended a hand in her direction, she understood she wasn't being invited. She was being summoned to fulfill a purpose that had been planned long before her birth. What happened during the hours that followed would forever remain fragmented in Rebecca's memory, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting only distorted pieces of truth. There were lights that penetrated not just her eyes, but her very soul. Voices that spoke directly in her mind, whispering secrets about humanity's future and the role her family would play in the evolution or corruption of the species. And there was pain, not physical, but existential, as if something fundamental in her human nature was being removed and replaced with something she couldn't name. Rebecca awakened with the first ray of sun bathing her naked skin in the middle of the cornfield, her body arranged in a position suggesting reverence or sacrifice. The earth around was marked with burned symbols that hurt the eyes when observed directly, and the air carried a metallic odor that wasn't blood, but something more fundamental, the smell of reality itself being altered. Her clothes had disappeared completely, but her body showed no signs of physical violence. The violation had occurred at a much deeper level, in parts of her essence she didn't even know existed. Something had been planted inside her, and she knew with terrible certainty that she would never be the same again. The return to the house was a journey through slightly altered reality, where every familiar object seemed to carry sinister meanings it hadn't possessed before. Smoke from the chimney indicated someone had lit the fire, but Rebecca knew she had left the children sleeping deeply. When she opened the door, she found Thomas, Mary, Benjamin, and Sarah sitting at the kitchen table in perfect stillness, their eyes turned toward the entrance as if they had been waiting for her arrival all along. There was no surprise on their faces, no questions about where she had spent the night, only serene acceptance that was more terrible than any crying or despair. "The tall man took care of us, Mama," said Sarah, with the astonishing naturalness of a 3-year-old reporting something completely normal. The words froze Rebecca's blood more effectively than any direct threat. Mary nodded. "He said you would return when the work was finished." Thomas, always the most observant, added he had very long hands and eyes that shone like stars, and he didn't speak with his mouth. Benjamin, who rarely spoke since the changes began, whispered he said we're a special family now. The description corresponded exactly to the figures that haunted Rebecca's memory fragments. They had been in her house, with her children, and somehow, that had been only the beginning. In the weeks following Samuel's return, the Whitmore farm became the stage for a silent and relentless transformation. The first unquestionable sign came when Rebecca discovered she was pregnant, a mathematical impossibility that defied not only the chronology of her intimacy with Samuel, but the very laws of human biology. The baby grew with unnatural speed, its movement in the womb creating ripples in her skin that formed geometric patterns that hurt the eyes. And during nights, when Rebecca lay in bed, she could swear she heard whispers coming from inside her own body, voices speaking in languages that preceded humanity. The changes in the other children accelerated as the gestation progressed. Thomas developed the ability to predict events with terrible precision, not visions of happiness, but anticipatory knowledge of deaths, accidents, and misfortunes that would strike the local community. Mary began singing songs that made adults cry without knowing why, melodies that carried sadness so profound it seemed to connect directly to the soul. Benjamin spoke with animals in a language they understood, but the creatures that obeyed him were no longer the same. Their eyes glowed with intelligence that shouldn't exist in beasts. Sarah, the youngest, demonstrated abilities that were simultaneously fascinating and absolutely terrifying. Objects moved when she observed them with concentration, flowers withered or bloomed at the touch of her small hands, and frequently she described places that didn't exist in the physical world. Landscapes of alien beauty, where beings like those who had visited her mother walked among crystalline structures under skies of impossible colors. But most disturbing was her ability to see through lies. No adult could hide anything from Sarah, for she simply looked into their eyes and pronounced truths they preferred to keep hidden. The birth of Elizabeth, the first child conceived after the light's visit, marked the beginning of a new era of horror for the Whitmore family. She came into the world during a night when the same lights returned, hovering over the house like cosmic witnesses to the event. The child didn't cry at birth. Instead, she emitted musical sounds that resonated at frequencies that made glass vibrate, and the adults present feel inexplicable nausea. Her eyes, when they finally opened, glowed with the same bluish light as the visitors. Elizabeth had been born, but what grew from Rebecca's womb wasn't entirely human. It was something new, something that represented the first step toward a future humanity wasn't prepared to face. Dr. Ezra Collins, who had attended the birth with trembling hands, documented in his personal diary the anomalies he observed. Heartbeat twice as fast as normal, body temperature that constantly varied, and reflexes suggesting neurological development impossible for a newborn. More disturbing still, the child seemed to understand adult conversations, her luminous eyes following every word with attention, suggesting full intelligence. The doctor burned his notes 3 days later, unable to bear the implications of what he had witnessed. Some truths were too large for the human mind to process. As Elizabeth grew, and she grew at frightening speed, doubling in size within weeks, her influence over the family became undeniable. The other children were drawn to her like metal to a magnet, spending hours observing their hybrid sister with reverence bordering on worship. Rebecca frequently found all 4 children gathered around the crib, whispering in a language she couldn't understand, as if sharing secrets that transcended normal human communication. And always when this happened, the room's temperature dropped several degrees, and shadows moved on walls even without light sources to create them. Samuel tried to maintain the facade of normalcy, but the community of Millbrook began whispering about strange changes in the Whitmore family. Neighbors reported that their clocks stopped when passing the property, that compasses spun uncontrollably, and that wild animals migrated to the farm as if seeking something only they could sense. Reverend Miller visited the family to offer prayers, but left the house babbling about eyes that contained eternities, and never returned. The local church organized prayer meetings to exorcise demonic influences, but participants frequently left the meetings with visions of a future where creatures like Elizabeth ruled a transformed world. The second birth occurred only 8 months after the first, when Rebecca gave birth to Marcus Edge, a child whose presence made plants grow uncontrollably and whose crying could break glass within a radius of several miles. The pattern was established. Each birth brought children more altered, more powerful, more distant from original humanity. Samuel watched his offspring expand with a mixture of perverted paternal pride and existential horror, understanding he had become progenitor of a new species that would eventually replace humanity. Evolution was occurring in his own home, and he was simultaneously witness and victim of the process. David, the third hybrid, was born with abilities that far surpassed those of his older siblings. At just a few months old, he could levitate objects and manipulate basic elements, making water boil with a glance, and creating small flames that danced between his fingers without burning him. His presence affected mechanical devices so dramatically that clocks stopped permanently in his proximity, and metal tools heated until they became incandescent when he touched them. Collins, forced to attend the births for lack of alternatives, had meticulously documented the hybrid children's development before suffering a nervous breakdown that left him babbling about abominations walking with angels' faces. As the 3 hybrid children grew, their powers began interacting in ways that challenged not only science but reality itself. Elizabeth could see future events through vivid dreams that always materialized with terrible precision. Marcus controlled not just plant growth, but could accelerate or slow any biological process. David had transcended simple element manipulation and begun altering molecular structures, transmuting basic substances into more complex forms with mere thought. Together they represented a force that could reshape the world or destroy it completely. The local community couldn't ignore for long the changes emanating from the Whitmore property. Farmers reported that their crops failed when planted too close to the family's farm, while the Whitmore's fields produced abundantly even during the most severe droughts. Wild animals migrated to the property in increasing numbers, creating a supernatural menagerie that watched the house with eyes that glowed in the dark. Some people developed debilitating headaches when approaching the house, while others reported experiences of spontaneous healing, as if the very presence of the hybrid children could alter human biology in unpredictable ways. In 1854, when Elizabeth completed her first 6 years of hybrid existence, she made a statement that chilled the blood of all present. "Those who created us are returning. They want to see how we've grown." The statement was made during dinner with the naturalness with which a normal child would comment about the weather, but the implications were absolutely terrifying. Marcus and David nodded as if they too were aware of the imminent visit, their luminous eyes shining with anticipation that seemed more appropriate to predators awaiting prey than children expecting visitors. The October full moon brought more than visitors. It brought revelations that would completely reformulate the family's understanding of their place in the cosmos and humanity's future. The lights descended again, but this time landed directly in the yard, and the figures that emerged were clearer, more defined, more obviously non-human in their alien magnificence. They communicated directly with the three hybrid children in a language of musical sounds and telepathic images that made the house's structure tremble in sympathetic resonance. During that night of revealing horror, the visitors communicated the true extent of their project through Elizabeth, who translated their words with an expression of absolute reverence that chilled her parents' blood. The Whitmore family was just one of hundreds scattered across continents, each serving as an incubator for different aspects of humanity's forced evolution. Some families developed radiation resistance, others gained the ability to process toxic atmospheres, still others received telepathic abilities for communication in a world where traditional technology would fail completely. Elizabeth, Marcus, and David represented a lineage specialized in domination over living systems. They would be the new lords of the biosphere. The visitors also brought warnings that sounded like prophecies of damnation. Humanity would resist forced evolution, try to destroy what they represented, and fail catastrophically. They showed visions of a near future where families like the Whitmores would be hunted, burned alive, torn apart by panicking mobs. But they also revealed that when planetary changes became evident, when Earth began rejecting unmodified life forms, humanity would turn to hybrids, not as saviors, but as new masters. The transition would be violent, bloody, and irreversible. Before departing, the visitors made a final demonstration that made clear the Whitmore family had crossed the point of no return in their transformation. They touched each family member, transferring knowledge directly into their minds, not wisdom or understanding, but raw information about the role each would play in humanity's subjugation. Samuel saw himself as creator of a lineage of predators, Rebecca as incubator of a new dominant species, the hybrid children as the first of a ruling caste that would govern over humanity's remains with absolute power and non-existent mercy. When the visitors finally departed, they left behind a family fundamentally corrupted in their very essence. Samuel and Rebecca were no longer proud parents, but conscious caretakers of abominations that grew in power each day. They now understood that the events of 1847 hadn't been a fortuitous encounter, but the first move in a cosmic war where humanity had lost before even realizing it was under attack. Their responsibilities transcended any human concept of parenthood. They were nurturing the seeds of their own species' extinction, and the terrible irony was that they did so moved by paternal love that had been perverted and transformed into an instrument of destruction. In the following years, the Whitmore family lived a double existence that slowly corroded their sanity. Externally, they maintained a fragile facade of normalcy, but internally they educated all children about their true natures and the destiny awaiting humanity. Elizabeth, Marcus, and David practiced their abilities with dedication more appropriate to soldiers preparing for war than children playing. The other children, though not hybrids to the same degree, had been altered enough to serve as agents and spies in a conflict that would unfold across generations. As the hybrid children approached adolescence, their powers intensified in ways that made local reality bend around their presence. Elizabeth could communicate mentally with anyone within a 50-mile radius, planting thoughts and false memories with terrible ease. Marcus had learned to control not just plants but any form of biological life, including humans, as an ability he secretly tested on unsuspecting neighbors. David had transcended molecular manipulation and begun altering physical laws themselves in localized areas, creating zones where gravity, time, and space obeyed his capricious will. The moment the family had feared and anticipated came in 1859, when Elizabeth publicly demonstrated her abilities during an accident at the local agricultural fair. A child had fallen into a deep well, and Elizabeth, without considering consequences, used her telekinetic abilities to save her before dozens of witnesses. That night, a crowd gathered at the Whitmore property, but not as the benevolent visitors Rebecca had hoped for. They came with torches, crosses, and clear intention to purify what they saw as demonic infestation. The hiding phase had ended abruptly, and the conflict between humanity and its evolutionary successors was about to begin with bloody and irrevocable violence. The battle that followed that October night would be remembered by the few survivors as the moment they realized humanity had lost its position atop the evolutionary food chain. Elizabeth, Marcus, and David didn't flee from the enraged mobs. They faced it with powers that turned grown men into marionettes, that made weapons turn against their own bearers, that rewrote local physical laws until reality itself became a weapon. When the sun rose over Millbrook, 23 bodies lay scattered across the property, all dead in ways that defied medical understanding. Samuel and Rebecca watched their hybrid children methodically clean blood from their hands with the cold efficiency of experienced butchers, finally understanding they had raised not children, but predators using angelic faces to mask absolutely inhuman natures. Elizabeth smiled at her parents with teeth stained red. Now they know our time has come. The war between humanity and its successors had officially begun, and the first massacre clearly demonstrated which side possessed decisive evolutionary advantage. The family was forced to abandon Vermont, but they discovered they weren't fleeing, they were being summoned. Other hybrid families converged on an isolated mountainous region of Colorado, as if an invisible force was gathering all modified lineages in a safe location. Elizabeth could communicate telepathically with hybrid children from other families, forming a collective consciousness network extending hundreds of miles. A new society was being born in the mountains, built on the bones of humanity left behind. It wasn't a community of refugees, but headquarters for conquerors awaiting the right moment to reclaim the planet they considered theirs by evolutionary right. In the following decades, the hidden community grew and developed into a civilization functioning according to principles that would have driven original humans mad with horror. Elizabeth married another hybrid and gave birth to children whose abilities surpassed anything previous generations had manifested. These children didn't need food in the traditional sense. They fed directly on life force, draining essence from plants, animals, and occasionally humans who ventured too close to their territory. They were beautiful, terrible, and absolutely without human empathy or conscience. The hybrid civilization expanded in secret, infiltrating human society through children who could pass as normal until their abilities manifested. They became scientists, doctors, teachers, politicians, always working to weaken humanity from within while strengthening their own kind. The original visitors' plan was working perfectly. Humanity was being replaced, not through open war, but through gradual infiltration and genetic corruption that spread like a virus through the species. By the turn of the 20th century, hybrid lineages had spread across the globe, each generation more powerful and less human than the last. They no longer saw themselves as evolved humans, but as an entirely new species for whom baseline humanity represented nothing more than livestock useful for labor and reproduction, but ultimately expendable. The children born of human hybrid unions were always hybrid, the corrupted genes dominating and transforming anything they touched. Elizabeth lived to see the dawn of the modern age. Her consciousness expanded beyond individual existence to become part of a collective mind that spanned continents. Through this network, she and her descendants orchestrated humanity's decline with methodical precision. Wars were instigated to cull human populations. Diseases were engineered to weaken resistance. Technologies were guided to create dependencies that made humans easier to control. The final phase began in the 21st century, when hybrid abilities had evolved to the point where they no longer needed to hide. Climate change, environmental destruction, and social collapse created the perfect conditions for their emergence as humanity's successors. They revealed themselves not as saviors, but as the new apex species claiming their rightful dominion over a dying world. Humanity's last defenders fought desperately, but they were facing an enemy that had been planning their destruction for over a century, that possessed abilities bordering on the supernatural, and that felt no more emotional connection to humans than humans felt to the animals they slaughtered for food. The war was brief, brutal, and decisive. In the end, Rebecca's midnight journey into that Vermont cornfield had been the first step in humanity's journey to extinction. Samuel's acceptance of the impossible had opened the door to their species' replacement. Elizabeth's first telepathic word had begun a conversation that would end with human silence forever. The lights had come, the children were born changed, and through them, the world itself had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The few humans who survived did so as servants to their hybrid masters, kept alive only as long as they remained useful. Earth belonged to Elizabeth's descendants now, and they ruled it with the same cold efficiency their ancestors had shown that first night when they cleaned human blood from their hands. The Whitmore family's story had ended not with redemption or hope, but with the absolute triumph of something that wore human faces while harboring appetites that would have made demons weep with envy. After the lights came to Vermont, no child was born normal. And in the end, that transformation had consumed not just a single family, but the entire human race. The lights were gone because they were no longer needed. Their work was complete, their harvest gathered, their experiment a success beyond their most ambitious projections. Humanity had been replaced by something infinitely more terrible, creatures that remembered being human just enough to make their current nature even more monstrous. The age of humanity was over. The age of the hybrids had begun, and in the end it had all started with a woman following strange lights into a cornfield on a cold Vermont night in 1847. Are you captivated by tales that blur the line between reality and nightmare? Stories where ordinary families face cosmic horrors beyond comprehension? Subscribe now for more bone-chilling narratives that will make you question what lurks in the shadows of our world. Don't miss our next terrifying journey into the unknown. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we explore the darkest corners of human experience. New nightmares await those brave enough to listen.